So lately I've been thinking a lot about our mental models of the snowpack and how that really works, how we take pieces of information and then limited information about the snowpack and can look out at the terrain and make a lot of extrapolations and have a fairly in-depth understanding of the terrain. And there's a couple of reasons why I've been interested in this. One is as a public forecaster, when you move to a new region, you quickly need to build a mental model of the snowpack and understand the conditions. This can be challenging in both cases when there's not much data or when there's a lot of data to look at. Somehow combining the information you have to have a quick picture of the snowpack is key. And this also becomes interesting as a researcher, where I'm aware of a lot of developing technologies that are in the future will give us new information about the snowpack. And to make sense of this new type of information, we need to understand how we perceive the snowpack to combine it in a way that's useful. Some of the examples of new sources of data we could have in the future about the snowpack are more and more recreational observations coming from different groups of people. There's probes that can quickly sample a lot of hardness profiles in different areas. Remote sensing technology has really taken off. These are radar sensors that can take transects of the snow properties. Similar types of remote sensing technology can work on drones and satellites to retrieve a wide number of different properties of the snowpack. And then there's my own work with numeric models, which can make predictions about the snowpack. And I think pushing ahead as these technologies improve and refine, there's going to be more and more ways to get information about the snowpack and potentially allow us to change the way we actually look at the snowpack instead of taking sparse snow pits and interpolating, having more tools at our disposal to really have a new look at the snowpack. So I'm really been thinking about how we can combine these data with our mental models of the snowpack to help us do that. And the first idea that came to mind was thinking of what having a lot of manual snow pits look like. And one of the first ideas was the work of Cam Campbell, where we were and others who were doing spatial variability studies and digging a ton of pits on the same slope. In this case, if you haven't seen this image before, these are all different roof block test results. And it just kind of shows you that you can have a ton of information about the snowpack, but it could still be hard to interpret it and know how to make a decision with that. Similar challenges can apply if you move up in spatial scale. This is a satellite image of the Spearhead Range with Whistler Village in the top left. And here's the Spearhead Traverse route. And you can imagine if someone traveled along and took a ton of snow profiles along that route, and at the end of the day, you have all this information available to you on your desk. It's not a simple, quick task to have a quick mental picture of what the snowpack actually looks like from this kind of information. If I was to look at that, I would probably start by looking at the locations of where these pits were dug, and then maybe sort them by some kind of location information, such as aspect or elevation, and then start to go through each pit and look for maybe certain weak layers, test results, and then combine that to build some mental picture of how all these individual pieces of snowpack data fit together into something you can work with, such as a whiteboard profile. But the problem with that method is it's quite tedious and labor-intensive to go through each profile, and it doesn't necessarily scale up if in the future we have thousands of snow pits being done by amateurs or recreationists, satellites taking information about snow depth in different areas, and possibly numeric models giving us more types of information. And just to show an example of what a high-density set of snowpack data could look like, I'm going to show some results from a numeric model, but really I don't want to get into the details of how this specific model works, its strengths and weaknesses, but more so use it as this idea of what a more complete picture of the snowpack could look like. So I'm going to use the snowpack snow evolution model, which has been mentioned a few times this week. And these, in short, use weather inputs and simulate the formation of layers over time. This example is going to be for the Whistler Heli tenure for the last winter, where I found 415 different locations to get weather data from a weather forecast model. And at each of these locations, produce a profile for flat field conditions, north, east, and southwest slopes. The results, you have roughly 2,000 profiles per day covering different areas and different types of terrain throughout the region. So if we go back to this example of the Spearhead Range, there's 11 grid points in this area, and we can produce snow profiles at each of these points. And similar to the last, the actual manual profiles I showed before, you need to do some kind of sorting or interpretation about what kind of terrain each of these profiles represents. What elevation is it in? What part of the region is it? So you can do things like sort them by elevation and then look at all the different aspects. And now here we have snow profiles for every day of the season for this relatively small part of the region, roughly 50 profiles a day. And we can see there's some similarities and differences between the profiles, capturing some of the conditions you might expect to find in that region. Certainly not all of the snowpack conditions, but a decent amount of the variable conditions you could have there. And then if we scale this up to the full tenure, we're now dealing with thousands of profiles. And if we go up to the scale of forecast regions, it's tens of thousands of profiles. So clearly we need some ways to simplify a complex or large data set of snowpack data. And that's what I'm working on with a number of students at SFU with how to do. Some of the methods we're looking at are visualization, using visual analytics to draw our attention to the main patterns in this data, aggregation, or combining profiles into a simple or single representative snow profile, and classification, which is, in our case, using terminology from the conceptual model and avalanche problems to describe the profiler in simple terms rather than details about layers. So with the visualization work, I've been working quite a bit with Stan, who talked yesterday, and he has been reinforcing this mantra with data visualization about overview first, then zoom and filter and details on demand. So that means we had to figure out a way to get a quick overview of 2,000 profiles in one quick view. And this animation here shows 2,000 profiles for the whole Whistler heli-ski tenure, each one with a little vertical line. And they're sorted from the thinnest to the thickest. And the colors represent the different grain types. And this kind of quick overview image, you can quickly see some patterns emerge as to how the snowpack will vary from a thin snowpack area up to a thicker snowpack area. These particular grain colors, there's quite a bit to interpret with them. We can look at another property such as grain size. Here now it's a bit of a simpler image. We just look for darker blue colors to highlight where facets, surface, or depth or might be. Another obvious way to visualize this data is on a map. And one of the interesting concepts that Stan showed me is this concept of a glyph, which is some kind of icon that you put on a map, but you play with your depth perception and you get different amounts of information. So these little icons from these locations across Whistler Heli tenure are 2 weeks of HST amounts. And you can play with your depth perception, and really, at a rough scale, you can see that it's more spiky west of Pemberton and slightly north of Pemberton compared to more inland. And it can give you a quick snapshot that there's been more recent snow in that area. But then you can also zoom into more specifics and look at an individual icon and see how much it snowed in that area, when. And this idea of glyphs and special icons seems quite powerful. We could maybe put information about different aspects in an icon, like aspect elevation roses or other things like that. For aggregation, our main idea is to do something along the lines of a representative snow profile, similar to what you would draw on a whiteboard. And we've been working on a number of statistical methods to find common features, such as storm snow weak layers, and map them together and come up with a single average snow profile that represents the main conditions you have in there. When you can do that, then you can group your sets of profiles in different ways. We can do a profile for below tree line and alpine, or in this case, for different operating zones within their tenure, to see the large differences between a snow profile in the west versus east, north versus south. The final method is classification. Moses yesterday talked about linking weather and snowpack data to avalanche problem types. And we're interested in further exploring this idea and using terminology from the conceptual models such as size, likelihood, problem types, and looking through the raw profile data and classifying it in some way. One of the examples Moses showed yesterday was that storm slab problems were predicted fairly well with the amount of 3-day settled storm snow in a modeled profile. So we can, on this same map area, look at that variable over the course of the season and kind of see the progression of main storm events over the period. Then we can take classification rules and identify which areas may be experiencing storm slab problems. And these are really crude visualizations right now of maybe where these ideas could go eventually once we've refined the nuances of how to classify these problem types. Similar with avalanche or persistent slab problems, we can look through profiles to count weak layers, yellow flags, lemons, these types of things, and have some kind of approximate heat map of where persistent slab problems could exist. So to conclude it, we're exploring these tools to visualize, aggregate, and classify snowpack data, and it seems like a fairly powerful way to deal with large volumes of data. And it often comes back, I find, to organizing it along some kind of dimension, whether it's spatially on a map, grouping things by elevation or aspect. But what often becomes challenging is there's too many dimensions in the real world of things that are causing variability in the snowpack. And it's hard to show this on a 2D screen, a visual that shows all of the things that come into play in the snowpack. And that's why I keep coming back to these mental models that we use to visualize the snowpack. Somehow, internally, we're able to make sense of all of these sources of variability and have some kind of mental picture of what the snowpack actually looks like. And I think by understanding this process better, we can feed in different data sources to try to improve our way of doing that. Finally, before finishing, I'd like to thank the NSERC Research Chair supporters for Pascal, as well as the project collaborators. And special thanks to Pascal and Avalanche Canada for letting me work on this.